right? This is what Anglos believe. If the Nazis aren't the very worst that ever was, then gee, we killed a lot of people in the Second World War, and what for, right? Like, this is something that we need to believe, right? And this is why I'm very cynical about the way that the whole Nazi thing has been sort of like just quietly spoon-fed to us in the Anglo nations, because I've seen the opinion polls. The reality is that fewer than 3% of Ukrainians belong to any political party for the last 20 years. That's the facts, right?
Yep.
So how is this a nation of Nazis? Bullshit. The other thing is, the guy who paid for Zelensky is named Kolomoisky, right? I don't know if you know about Kolomoisky, but he's a notorious gangster, and he's Jewish, right? Or he claims to be. He paid for the Azov battalion to manufacture these huge flags, right, of SS symbols and wave them around in the world, right? Victoria Nuland, who's a Jew and who's married to a Jew, both from Lithuania, whose people were brutalized by the Nazis. They were funding, right, these Nazi symbols. And the people they were giving them to were 17-year-old football hooligans. These guys didn't know anything about the National Socialist Party of Germany, right? They didn't know what they were being handed. These propaganda symbols, and the camera just happened to be there. It's like, you know, the thing is, if the Western media don't want you to see something, right, it's pretty hard to see it. And and there's nobody that I know in the Anglo world that isn't painfully aware that Ukraine has got Nazis in it. I'm very skeptical. I think Ukraine's got a lot of poor people in it. I think Ukraine's got a lot of manipulated people in it. And so, Sebastian, you got to understand, we're not talking about truth here. We're talking about what Anglos need to believe, right? Because otherwise our grandparents weren't heroes fighting on the side of warm puppies and all good things, right?
Right, that's the Commonwealth identity case.
I
agree.
Express also my opinion. Okay, so I think that it's about utilizing these groups and not supporting their ideology as a thing to stay there forever. And it's also not a lie that people that are fanatics, like they support this kind of ideas, they are better warriors. So why not to fund Nazis in Ukraine? But not only that, we shall not forget that before the 2014, the country that had the most Nazis was Russia.
Yeah, exactly right.
But it's not that I'm trying to blame Russia, but I'm trying to explain that there is a Nazi culture in all post-Soviet countries. But this trend, let's say, it's not about an actual belief in Nazis. It's in a sense an anti-communism, but not in the communism as a whole, but to this part that supported the atheism in post-imperial Russian states or whatever. Because the truth is that all the Slavs, all the populations of the post-Russian Empire, they were brutalized by these communist policies of atheism and suppressing their culture. So then the Nazism for them is more about, let's say, a religious enlightenment and a kind of nationalism, and not Nazism in its brutalism, substance of killing and murdering people. It was just more about using the symbols, like being a fanatic of a football team.
Yeah.
Something that, if you think about it, most of the neo-Nazis were also hooligans. And
Georgios is right, especially in the Baltics.
Yeah.
In the Baltics, that's very true.
So I would think, no, if you didn't finish, the if you're talking about the Nazis themselves, they basically allied with everyone who could support their cause during the Second World War. So it's not about just ideology. It's more about anybody who could fight the communists in 1941 at that time, because they needed enough troops to hold the front. Similar situation is today, but the scale is much bigger. So if we are looking at um, Ukraine permanently being Nazified because they supported the Russians at that time, I don't think that's the correct perspective. It's
That's not
actually
why.
what speaking earlier, that we have a lot of symbols which have come in, a lot of people who didn't grow up in that era, and they don't really understand what it means actually to support the Nazis. It's more about, this is my enemy, somebody else is fighting my enemy, let's support them. So as soon as the Second World War ended, and I mean, when they initially invaded, the Germans were actually welcomed by the Ukrainians and a large part of the occupied Eastern Europe areas, because the communist regime was that brutal. But, and in fact, if you look at the Warsaw Uprising later on, it was that brutal. Even the next 20, 30 years, that's why Poland still hates Russia. Does the average population really hate Russia in that deep, seething regard as the Nazis do? No, not really. But mostly people would not be happy with the Russians because that's what they've been taught. And I think what's happened is in the 90s, there were still a lot of people who had some sympathy towards Russia. But as um, if you look at television discourse, movies, anything, any media, we find that the Russians are um, really the villains everywhere. So if you grow up in an era where the young people come across the Russians as the bad people, and the EU and the Euro is now where it is, and it's now a monolithic world in which the Americans are dictating everything. In that case, would you ally yourself with the Russians? And then you will see your country has some hero symbols who had fought the Russians. Um, what was the SS? Yeah, nobody really needs to dig into it. How many people really dig into which divisions and which commanders did what, who was which country? Because if you actually look into the war crimes, it's quite clear that even the people who joined the SS battalions from the Ukrainian side, they too indulged in some of those crimes. So they don't really get into the nuances of all of this.
Some of the worst ones, actually.
Do people hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just want to, thanks for having me on. I just wanted to I made an observation that kind of relates to both Toby, Captain Georgia, and Abhinav, and that's kind of how it kind of, we can kind of see the identity politics being infused in all of this. Like, for example, the Jews being collaborating with Nazis and so forth. But kind of dismissing as if Jews cannot be opportunistic itself, in the same way as Obama being the first black president, but the incarceration of African Americans increased with his, and so on and so on. And then, as Abhinav kind of, I would say, astutely pointed out, you can have all these ideologies and dogmas going about. These are mostly used to sway the majority, but when it boils down to the realpolitik of it all, you can see like, oh yeah, ideological enemies, we can still have, we're supposed to not be on the same team, but we can help you. Like, and here we have, Victoria Nuland and Zelensky, what does it even mean being Jewish? What does it mean being Ukrainian or Slav? This becomes incredibly diffused very quickly, but we see the propaganda from both sides, of course, in all directions, tend to be kind of playing on these age-old concepts. And I just kind of noticed, like, as you guys are talking about it, like it's kind of unavoidable at this point, noticing how like the conflation of historical relevance, but it is a very subjective application of how important it is, and it's very selective when it is even applied. So yeah, I just like the nuances and would like to point that out.